hiking in the Alaskan wilderness. It was in late summer, almost 9 months ago now, when their smiling faces first started appearing on missing person flyers tacked up to lodge bulletin boards, taped to the walls of ranger stations, and posted on trailhead information boards across the state. At first, I didn't pay it much more mind than I had countless other cases I had read about during my time working search and rescue operations in Alaska. The wilderness here swallows people whole. It's something you come to accept after you've spent enough years in these mountains, watching tourists, adventurers, and sometimes even seasoned outdoorsmen underestimate just how brutal and unforgiving the land can be. But something about them, maybe it was their age, maybe it was the way their photographs looked, maybe it was the desperation written all over the missing posters, stuck with me, clung to me in a way I didn't expect. And when months passed without any word, without any trace, without a single clue about what had happened, their absence became something heavier, a shadow that followed me every time I stepped onto the trails I had hiked 100 times before. Caleb and Marissa were only in their 20s. Both had come to Alaska from out of state, wide-eyed dreamers who had left behind city lives for a summer of raw adventure. They weren't foolish kids, at least not in the way some are when they stumble up here thinking they'll just pitch a tent, fish a little, and soak in the glory of nature. From what I later gathered, they had planned their trip carefully, had packed well, and had hiked smaller trails before attempting the longer routes that branched out into Denali's shadow. But Alaska doesn't care about plans. It doesn't care about gear, or preparation, or the enthusiasm of youth. Out here, the forest doesn't just stretch, it devours. Rivers flood without warning, cliffs crumble, weather changes in a blink, and the line between being alive and becoming part of the endless white wilderness is thinner than a whisper. I've seen it too many times before. Still, the fact that two healthy, prepared young people could just vanish, leaving behind no footprints, no supplies, no scraps of campfire remains, it didn't sit right with me then, and it doesn't now. The day they disappeared, September 12th, had started clear. Other hikers reported seeing them at the trailhead, smiling and laughing, adjusting the straps on their packs before they headed into the tree line. The trail they chose wasn't the most dangerous one by any means, but it wasn't an easy stroll either. It climbed steadily into dense forest, with narrow passes, sudden drops, and streams that had to be crossed by slick stones or fallen logs. It was known for being a favorite among locals who wanted a challenge, but not a death wish. I had hiked it myself dozens of times, sometimes alone, sometimes with my fellow rangers. I knew its dangers, but I also knew that if you kept your head on straight, you could navigate it without issue. Caleb and Marissa never made it out. Search teams scoured the area for weeks afterward, helicopters buzzing overhead, dogs sniffing through thickets, volunteers combing the underbrush with sticks, calling their names into the wind. Nothing. Not a single shred of clothing, not a discarded water bottle, not even tracks leading off trail. It was as if the wilderness had inhaled them and simply never exhaled. As time passed, their case slipped from headlines and from the conversations of the locals, replaced by new stories, new accidents, new missing persons. But I couldn't shake it. Maybe it was because I had met them, though at the time I didn't realize I had. A memory came back to me later, faint, almost ghostly, of a young couple walking into the ranger station a few days before their last hike, asking about weather conditions, about the trails, about which routes were safer, and which ones had the best views. I had been tired that day, scribbling notes about trail maintenance, half listening as I gave them the usual rundown. I remembered Marissa's eager smile, Caleb's polite nods, the way they clutched the map like it was a golden ticket. I had looked them in the eye and told them what to expect, told them to watch the weather, told them to stick to the marked paths. And then I had gone about my day. When I saw their faces on those missing posters later, I felt a pit open in my stomach. They had asked me for guidance. I had given it to them. And still they were gone. The wilderness grew quiet after the search ended. Winter came early, as it often does here, and with it came deep snow that buried the trails and erased any lingering clues the couple might have left behind. I spent those months patrolling as usual, but every time I passed that trailhead, I felt a weight pressing against my chest. Sometimes, in the hush of the forest, I thought I heard voices. Faint, far away, as though someone was calling out through a tunnel of snow and stone. I chalked it up to my imagination, or to the wind howling through the trees, but it unsettled me all the same. Alaska does that to you, makes you hear things, makes you see shadows where there are none. But sometimes those shadows are real. By the time spring thaw arrived, 9 months had passed since Caleb and Marissa vanished. Their families had stopped calling the ranger stations for updates. The case was cold, frozen like the rivers that had hidden beneath ice for months. That was when I made the discovery that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It started on an ordinary patrol, one I had done countless times before. The snow was melting, the river swollen with runoff, the air sharp with the smell of damp earth and thawing pine. I had been checking trails for fallen trees, making notes about places where repairs would be needed before summer hikers returned in droves. When to the old trail where they had last been seen, something compelled me to walk farther than I normally would have. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was guilt, maybe it was something else entirely, something I still can't quite name. Whatever it was, it drew me deep into the woods, where the trees grew close together and the light dimmed even in midday. It was there, in a hollow near the river's edge, that I found it. A discovery that made the hair on my arms stand on end, that made my stomach twist, that made me realize Caleb and Marissa's story was far from over. It wasn't much at first glance, just a shape half buried in mud, something pale and ragged sticking out from beneath a collapsed tree. At first I thought it was just another piece of trash, some camper's lost tarp or a scrap of fabric carried downstream. But as I crouched closer, brushing away wet earth with my gloves, I realized it was a backpack. The fabric was shredded, faded from exposure, but still intact enough to make out the brand logo. A brand I remembered from those missing posters. A brand I remembered Caleb wearing on his back the day they vanished. My chest tightened as I pulled it free, as water poured out of its seams, as I unzipped it with shaking fingers. Inside was a collection of items: a compass, a crushed water bottle, a notebook swollen with damp pages. And tucked into the side pocket, muddy but unmistakable, was a photograph. A photograph of Caleb and Marissa, smiling at the trailhead, the date scrawled on the back in Marissa's looping handwriting. September 12th, the day they disappeared. And as I stood there, holding that waterlogged backpack in my hands, I realized this was no ordinary accident. Something had happened out here, something the wilderness alone could not explain. I didn't move for a long time after I pulled that backpack free. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, the sound of the river dulling in my ears as I stared at the mud-stained photo of Caleb and Marissa. Their smiles were frozen in time, but knowing what had followed that captured moment, it felt more like a ghost's grin than a memory of happiness. I kept telling myself that hikers lose things all the time, that maybe the backpack had been carried downstream, that maybe its presence here was nothing more than chance. But deep down I knew better. Something about the way it was buried, wedged beneath a collapsed tree as though deliberately hidden, unsettled me more than anything else. If the river had simply dragged it along, it should have been battered, torn open, its contents scattered across rocks and banks. Yet everything inside, despite the mud and water, was intact. Almost as if someone had placed it there. Almost as if it was meant to be found, but only after the snow had passed. I set the bag down and tried to steady my breathing. As a ranger, I had been trained to catalog evidence, to mark locations, to preserve the scene before notifying authorities. Yet in that moment, my instincts battled with something primal: fear. Fear not of wildlife, not of the weather, but of the idea that I was not alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain that if I turned too quickly, I'd catch a figure darting behind a tree, watching from the shadows. My pulse hammered in my ears. Still, I forced myself to pull out the notebook, careful not to tear its sodden pages. The ink had run across most of them, words dissolving into smudges, but here and there I could make out phrases. Trails split, too quiet, not on the map. Then near the middle, a clearer line. Heard something at night, not an animal, like a voice. That was when my throat went dry. I closed the notebook, slid it back into the pack, and zipped it shut with trembling fingers. 1,000 thoughts swirled in my mind, none of them making sense. I had been in these woods long enough to know their sounds, to know the difference between the scream of a lynx, the cry of an eagle, the howl of wind through spruce branches. If Caleb and Marissa had written that what they'd heard wasn't an animal, I believed them. And if it had been a voice, that meant someone or something had been out there with them. I decided then and there to retrace what I could of their last known path. Not officially, if I radioed it in, the discovery of the backpack would trigger a whole new investigation, one that would rope in the state troopers, local police, maybe even federal authorities. But something told me that once this became a case again, the truth might be buried just as deep as that bag had been. Call it paranoia, call it instinct, but I needed to see for myself before anyone else got involved. So I marked the spot in my notebook, slung Caleb's pack over my shoulder, and started walking. The trail wound higher, climbing into rockier ground where snow still clung stubbornly in shaded hollows. The silence grew heavier the deeper I went, broken only by the occasional caw of a raven circling above or the drip of meltwater trickling down stone. I thought about how many times my boots had carried me here before, yet how different it felt now, as if I was trespassing on someone else's ground. At one point, I thought I saw something carved into the bark of a birch, 2 initials, C+M, scratched faintly, weathered by time. I ran my fingers over the grooves, imagining Marissa's laughter as she dragged the tip of a knife across the bark, Caleb standing beside her, telling her not to get caught. It should have been sweet, a reminder of young love, but instead it felt like a gravestone. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. About 2 miles past where the official search grid had ended months earlier, I found the remains of a fire pit. Not fresh, but not ancient either. The stones were blackened, the ash long since scattered by wind, but I knew it hadn't been there last summer. I crouched, studying it, my stomach sinking. Caleb and Marissa hadn't just wandered off and collapsed in the cold. They had made camp. They had survived at least a night out here. But then what? The notebook hadn't said much beyond those vague lines about voices. I scanned the ground for tracks, knowing the snowmelt would have erased most of them, but found only depressions that could have been from boots, or could have been from nothing at all. As the sun dipped lower, the woods grew colder, the shadows lengthening until every tree seemed to lean closer, whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. I should have turned back then, returned to the station with the pack, logged my discovery, and let the professionals take over. But I kept going. Something inside me needed answers, and I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep another night without at least trying to find them. So I pressed on, each step heavier than the last, until I reached a clearing I didn't recognize. It wasn't large, just a circular patch of ground ringed by stones, as though nature itself had drawn a boundary line. At the center stood something that made my skin crawl, a wooden frame, crudely lashed together with rope, shaped almost like a tripod. Hanging from it, swaying gently in the breeze, were strips of fabric. Some were torn beyond recognition, but one piece, faded red with a familiar pattern, stopped me cold. I had seen it before in the missing posters. It was Marissa's scarf. I staggered back, nearly tripping over my own boots. My breath came fast, my chest heaving as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't the work of nature. This wasn't an accident. Someone had been here. Someone had taken the time to build this shrine, this marker, whatever it was. And they had left behind pieces of the couple like trophies. The air in the clearing felt heavier than the forest, thick and suffocating. I could almost hear a hum, low and constant, though when I strained my ears I realized it wasn't a sound so much as a vibration in my bones. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave, but I couldn't pull my eyes from the tripod. My hand went instinctively to the sidearm on my belt, the weight of it reassuring, though it felt useless against whatever had made this. I forced myself to step closer, reaching out to touch the red fabric, half expecting it to crumble under my fingers. Instead, it was stiff, frozen with dirt and something darker. Blood, maybe. My stomach lurched. I turned away, fighting the urge to the blood rushing in my ears, but the memory felt too solid. Too real. I poured myself whiskey, stared into the flames of my wood stove, and wondered what in God's name Caleb and Marissa had stumbled into that night. That was when I noticed the carvings. Not on the trees this time, but on the stones that circled the clearing. Jagged lines, spirals, crude symbols that didn't match any language I knew. They looked old, weathered, as if they had been here far longer than 9 months. But the tripod, the fabric, that was fresh. My head spun with questions I didn't want answers to. Were Caleb and Marissa victims of someone living out here, some hermit or madman who had claimed this land? Or had they stumbled onto something older, something they were never meant to find? I don't know how long I stood there, staring at those stones, my thoughts unraveling like thread. The forest grew darker, colder, the hum in my bones louder. Finally, survival instinct kicked in. I turned and left the clearing, not caring about stealth anymore, crashing through underbrush until I found the trail again. My heart didn't stop pounding until I was nearly back at the river. Only then did I realize I was still clutching the backpack, my knuckles white around its straps. That night, back in my cabin, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that tripod swaying in the wind, Marissa's scarf dancing like a crimson flag, the symbols on the stones glowing faintly in the dark. I tried to tell myself I had imagined the hum, that it was nothing but. And more terrifying still, why did it feel like whatever had taken them was now aware of me? The next morning, I woke with the weight of unease still pressing down on me. I had barely slept, dozing off in short bursts only to jolt awake at the sound of branches scraping against my cabin windows or the creak of settling wood. Each time, I thought I heard something more, footsteps crunching on gravel outside, a faint whisper just beyond the door. When dawn finally broke, gray and reluctant, I felt no relief. If anything, the daylight only sharpened my dread, making it impossible to dismiss the memory of the clearing as some fevered dream. The backpack sat on my table, mud still clinging to its seams, the photograph inside staring at me like an accusation. I knew what I had to do, though every part of me resisted it. I needed to go back. I packed carefully this time. More food, extra ammunition, a flashlight, and a flare gun. I didn't know what I expected to face, but something inside me whispered that I should prepare for more than wild animals. Before leaving, I considered radioing the station, but my hand hovered over the mic and then fell away. If I told anyone what I had found, I would have to explain why I hadn't called it in immediately. I would have to hand over the backpack, the notebook, the photograph. And if what I had seen in that clearing was real, I wasn't ready for it to be buried under official reports and bureaucratic silence. I had seen it before, strange cases, things that didn't fit neatly into the categories of accident or foul play, quietly filed away and never spoken of again. No, this was mine now. My burden, my curse. I had to see it through. The trail felt different under the morning sun, though not in a comforting way. The brightness made the shadows starker, the silence heavier. Ravens followed me for a time, their black forms swooping low over the treetops, croaking as though mocking me. I told myself it was nothing unusual. Ravens are clever, curious birds, but their persistence unnerved me. By the time I reached the place where I had found the backpack, my nerves were already frayed. I half expected the bag to be gone, the mud smoothed over, as though the forest itself had conspired to erase my discovery. But the spot was just as I had left it, the hollow gaping beside the collapsed tree, dark with damp. I pushed deeper into the woods, retracing the path I had taken the day before. Every step felt heavier, every sound sharper. The forest was alive with subtle movements, branches bending where no wind blew, faint crunches in the undergrowth just out of sight. Once, I thought I caught a glimpse of something pale darting between the trees, but when I turned, there was nothing. My hand stayed close to the grip of my sidearm, though I never drew it. Fear is a tricky thing out here. It sharpens your senses, but it can also make you reckless. I told myself to keep calm, to stay steady. When I reached the clearing, the sight of it chilled me all over again. The tripod still stood, swaying gently, though the air was dead still. The strips of fabric hung like mute witnesses, and Marissa's scarf fluttered faintly, as if stirred by unseen fingers. I stepped carefully into the circle, my boots crunching on the stone boundary. The carvings were clearer in daylight, and I crouched to study them. Spirals, jagged lines, intersecting patterns. They weren't random. Someone or something had placed them with intent. I traced one with a gloved hand and felt an odd warmth in the stone, as though the sun had baked it, though the surrounding ground was cold. I wanted to take photographs, to document what I was seeing, but I had left my camera behind in my haste. Instead, I pulled the damp notebook from the backpack and began sketching the symbols, copying them as best I could onto fresh pages. My hand shook, making the lines waver, but I forced myself to continue. The longer I worked, the stronger the vibration in my bones became, that low hum I had felt the day before. It was like standing near a hive, though no bees buzzed in the air. My head throbbed, and nausea churned in my gut, but I kept drawing until I had filled several pages. Only then did I step back, breathing hard, the sweat cold on my neck. That was when I saw the bones. They were small at first, scattered near the base of one of the stones, a rib, a fragment of a jaw, tiny enough that I thought they might belong to an animal. But as I brushed away the leaves and dirt, more appeared. Long bones, jointed pieces, unmistakably human in shape. My hands trembled as I lifted one, dirt crumbling away to reveal the pale curve of a femur. Not Caleb or Marissa, I told myself that quickly, desperately. These were older, weathered, too far gone to have been from just 9 months ago. But that realization brought no comfort. It meant that others had been here before them. Others had not left. I staggered back, ball rising in my throat, and nearly dropped the bone. That was when I heard it, a sound faint but distinct, drifting through the trees. A voice. Low, murmuring, just at the edge of hearing. I froze, every muscle locked, listening. It wasn't English, not words I could understand, but it carried rhythm, cadence like chanting. My skin crawled. Slowly, I set the bone back down, my eyes scanning the tree line. The voice continued, rising and falling, sometimes near, sometimes distant, as though the forest itself was speaking. I don't remember making the decision to leave, only the frantic scramble that followed. My boots slipped on wet roots, my breath came ragged, branches tore at my jacket. The chanting seemed to follow me, weaving through the trees, echoing in ways that made it impossible to tell where it came from. By the time I stumbled back onto the main trail, my lungs burned and my legs shook. The woods behind me were silent again, as if mocking my fear. Back at the cabin, I slammed the door shut and locked it, though locks mean little out here. I dropped into a chair, my heart still racing, and stared at the sketches I had made. The symbols stared back, stark and alien, their curves and lines refusing to resolve into meaning. I poured another drink, hands unsteady, and tried to convince myself that I had misheard, that the chanting had been nothing but wind in the branches, a trick of panic. But deep down, I knew better. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to busy myself with chores, splitting wood, patching leaks in the roof, checking my gear, but every moment felt watched, as though eyes tracked me from just beyond the treeline. That night, sleep brought no peace. I dreamed of the clearing, of bones rising from the ground like roots, of Caleb and Marissa standing at the edge of the circle with hollow eyes and open mouths, their voices joining the chant. I woke drenched in sweat, the echo of the hum still vibrating in my skull. I left the cabin before sunrise, the forest still cloaked in fog. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the earthy scent of thawing soil and wet pine. My old pickup groaned as I started it, the engine coughing in the cold before finally turning over. The road out was little more than a winding gravel path, rutted and soft from the spring melt, but I drove it carefully, watching the treeline as if something might step out at any moment. The trip to my friend's place would take most of the day, skirting small towns and long stretches of wilderness. I told myself I was leaving to seek answers, to find someone who might believe me, but truthfully, I think I was running. Running from the clearing, from the bones, from that low hum that still seemed to reverberate in my skull. My friend's name was Walter Greaves, though most just called him Walt. He had been a ranger here for nearly 30 years before retiring to a small cabin further south, near the edge of a sleepy fishing village. I had always admired Walt. He was tough, practical, but there was something in his eyes that told you he had seen things most men would rather forget. Over the years, he had hinted at strange experiences during searches, unexplained lights in the woods, entire areas of trail that felt wrong to walk through, missing hikers found in places that defied all logic. He never spoke about it in official reports, but in the quiet of long patrol nights, he would share just enough to make you wonder. When he left the service, he told me simply, "There are things out here we aren't meant to understand, son. And one day, you'll see them too." I thought about those words as the miles rolled under my tires. Maybe this was what he had meant. Maybe I was finally seeing what he had hinted at, the things hidden beneath the wilderness's surface. The thought didn't comfort me. Instead, it gnawed at me because if Walt had left this behind, it meant whatever I had stumbled into wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. By midday, I reached the village. It was a small cluster of weathered houses and fishing boats, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. I parked by the pier and asked around until I was pointed toward Walt's cabin, a mile down a dirt road overlooking the bay. His truck sat outside, its paint faded, its tires caked with mud. When I knocked on his door, it opened slowly, revealing the man I hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. He looked older, thinner, his beard grayer, but his eyes were sharp as ever. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, studying me with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "I need your help," I told him. My voice cracked, and I realized how tired I was, how scared. I must have looked a wreck, mud on my boots, bags under my eyes, and a backpack slung over my shoulder like a burden I couldn't put down. He let me in without another word. His cabin was simple but tidy, lined with bookshelves crammed with old field guides, maps, and journals. A fire burned in the stove, filling the room with warmth and the smell of cedar smoke. I sank into a chair, and for a moment, I just sat there, breathing, as though the weight of the past days had finally caught up to me. Then I opened the backpack and laid its contents on the table, the notebook, the sketches, the scarf. Walt leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he examined each item. He flipped through the waterlogged notebook carefully, squinting at the smeared words, then turned to the pages of my sketches. His face tightened, his jaw clenching, and when he finally looked up at me, his expression was grim. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. I told him everything, from the discovery of the backpack by the river, to the clearing with the tripod and the symbols, to the bones and the chanting. I left nothing out, not even the part where I felt something had followed me back to the cabin. As I spoke, Walt didn't interrupt. He just listened, his eyes fixed on me, his fingers drumming softly on the table. When I finally finished, the silence in the cabin was suffocating. He leaned back, sighing heavily. "Damn it. I hoped you'd never come across something like this." "You've seen it before, haven't you?" I asked. Walt nodded slowly. "Not that exact clearing, no. But I've seen others. Markings like these, symbols cut into stone, places where the air hums like a beehive even when the forest is still. And I've seen what happens to people who stumble into them." A chill ran through me. What happens? They don't come back. Or if they do, they're not the same. He tapped the notebook. Voices in the night, wrong sounds in the trees. That's how it starts. Then it pulls them in. Sometimes we find bodies, sometimes just pieces, but most of the time, he shook his head. Most of the time, they vanish. I thought of Caleb and Marissa, their smiling faces on the missing posters. My chest ached. So, what is it? Some kind of cult? A person living out there? If only it were that simple, Walt muttered. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. There are old stories up here. Stories from before us, before the settlers, before even the trappers. The native people spoke of places in the woods that weren't meant to be entered. Sacred or cursed, depending on who you asked. They said the land remembers, that it holds things we can't understand. When I was younger, I dismissed it as folklore. But after what I've seen, he trailed off, shaking his head. I rubbed my temples, trying to make sense of it. So what do I do? Just leave it? Forget I ever found it? Walt's gaze was hard. You won't forget. It won't let you. Once you've stepped into its circle, it's already got its hooks in you. The best you can do is try to understand it before it understands you. His words chilled me, but at the same time, they sparked something stubborn inside me. I thought of the families of Caleb and Marissa, of the other bones I had seen in that clearing. People had died out there, and their stories had been swallowed whole. If there was a chance of uncovering the truth, I couldn't turn my back on it, no matter how much fear gnawed at me. I need to go back, I said finally. Walt studied me for a long time, then sighed. I figured you'd say that. He stood and walked to a shelf, pulling down an old canvas bag. From it, he retrieved a worn journal bound in cracked leather. He set it on the table and slid it toward me. What's this? I asked. Notes I kept over the years. Places like the one you found. Things I couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. If you're dead set on going back, you'll want to read this first. I opened the journal, and as I flipped through its pages, my stomach tightened. The sketches inside were almost identical to mine. Spirals, jagged lines, circles of stones. There were accounts of missing hikers, strange noises, flickering lights in the distance. Some entries were short, almost frantic, others more detailed. One passage caught my eye. Found another tripod structure today. Fabric tied to it. Not fresh, stiff with age. Same symbols on the stones. Felt watched the entire time. Heard whispers in my own voice. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. Jesus, Walt. How many of these places are there? The months dragged on after the helicopter lifted the young couple's bodies away from the frozen cliffside, yet the weight of that discovery did not lift from my chest. If anything, it grew heavier with time, like an anchor that had latched itself to my ribs and was pulling me deeper into the cold silence of Alaska's wilderness. I was no stranger to tragedy out here. This land was merciless, and I'd seen it swallow the careless, the arrogant, and the unlucky alike. But something about this case lingered like a shadow that never receded. It wasn't just the tragedy of two young people lost too soon. It was the questions, the inconsistencies, the gnawing sense that I had witnessed only the surface of a much darker truth hidden beneath layers of snow, ice, and silence. I tried, at first, to shove it aside, telling myself that I had done my duty. I had found them, given closure to their families, and fulfilled the grim role this land often demanded. But when I lay awake at night, I could hear the faint rattle of something metallic from that canyon, the memory of the rusted object I'd unearthed beside their remains, the battered, half-buried casing of an old trap, like something from another era, its jagged teeth long corroded, but still sharp enough to draw blood. It hadn't belonged to the couple. That much I knew. Its design was archaic, the kind of brutal steelwork outlawed decades ago. Yet it was there, lurking beneath the snow, close enough to where they had fallen that I couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. That thought haunted me until one morning, unable to take the silence anymore, I returned to the canyon alone. The journey back felt heavier than before. The forest seemed less like the home I'd grown to know and more like a labyrinth, keeping its secrets pressed deep into the earth. Snow still blanketed the ridges, though the season had begun its slow thaw. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, and beneath that scent was something else. Faint, sour, metallic. I told myself it was just my memory playing tricks, the echo of what I'd seen before. But as I approached the ravine, I noticed fresh disturbances in the ground, the kind that didn't belong to elk or wolves. They were shallow impressions, almost careful, like someone had tried to disguise their passage. I crouched, brushing away the damp moss, and my stomach turned when I saw it. Boot tracks, newer than mine, pressed faintly into the thawing soil. Someone else had been here since I'd reported the discovery. Someone who knew enough to avoid leaving a trail too easy to follow. I felt my jaw tighten as I scanned the ridgeline, the hairs at the back of my neck prickling as though unseen eyes were following me. But the forest gave nothing back, only the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant croak of ravens circling above the canyon. Against every instinct telling me to leave, I descended once more, driven by the same pull that had brought me here the first time. At the site where we had pulled the couple's bodies from the frozen shelf, the snow had receded, revealing more of the jagged rock face beneath. The silence there was oppressive, broken only by the slow drip of meltwater. I found myself drawn again to the spot where I'd uncovered the rusted trap. I knelt, digging carefully with my gloves until more metal teeth gleamed beneath the earth. But it wasn't just one trap. As I unearthed more, a sick realization struck. There were dozens scattered beneath the soil, hidden under snow and time, their jaws rusted but unmistakably lethal. These weren't the tools of hunters passing through. This was something else. A network. A perimeter. A field of iron jaws waiting silently for anything, or anyone, unlucky enough to stumble through. I sat back on my heels, my breath catching in the cold air as the truth pressed down on me. The couple hadn't simply fallen to their deaths. They had wandered into something they weren't supposed to find. Something man-made. Something someone had buried and wanted forgotten. That night, I returned to my cabin with a knot of dread twisting in my gut. I tried pouring myself a drink, tried focusing on the simple routine of lighting the stove, but I couldn't shake the memory of that iron field beneath the snow. My radio hissed with static in the corner, and I thought briefly about calling it in, filing an official report. But something stopped me. The boot prints. The silence of the forest that day, too heavy, too expectant. Someone knew what I'd found. Someone was still out there, watching, making sure no one dug too deep. The couple had disappeared for 9 long months before anyone stumbled across them, and now I couldn't shake the sense that their deaths hadn't been an accident at all. They had been erased. Sleep refused to come. When I did drift into restless dreams, they were filled with the crunch of snow under unfamiliar boots, the echo of metal snapping shut, and the muffled screams of voices carried away by the wind. I woke drenched in sweat, my hand reaching instinctively for the revolver I kept by the bed, though I had never needed it in all my years patrolling these forests. But now, for the first time, I felt unsafe in my own land. The wilderness had always been harsh, but it had been honest. What I felt now was something else entirely, a presence, human and hidden, coiled in the dark like a snare waiting to spring. I decided to follow the boot tracks again in daylight, tracing them back from a canyon to where they might have begun. It was a grueling process, the trail faint and often lost among rocks and roots, but persistence revealed fragments, a cigarette butt crushed into the soil, a broken strap from a pack, the faint imprint of something heavy dragged along the ground. The trail led me deeper into a part of the forest I rarely patrolled, a region locals whispered about but rarely entered. They called it the Hollows, a dense tangle of spruce and shadowed ravines where compasses often failed, and hunters claimed the woods seemed to shift when no one was looking. I'd always dismissed such talk as superstition, the kind that springs up anywhere the land feels too vast and indifferent for comfort. But as I entered those woods, I understood why people avoided them. The air felt colder, unnaturally so, and the silence grew thicker, pressing against my ears until even my own breathing sounded too loud. Hours passed before I found it. A clearing, ringed by trees bent unnaturally inward, as though leaning to conceal what lay at its center. There, half buried in moss and snow, stood the remains of old structures, cabins, lean-tos, and crude storage sheds, long abandoned but still exuding a presence that set my teeth on edge. Rusted equipment littered the ground, chains, saw blades, iron stakes, and the unmistakable frames of more traps. This hadn't been a hunter's camp. It had been something else, something organized, with a purpose I couldn't yet name. I moved slowly, every nerve alive, until I spotted it, a fresh carving on one of the wooden beams, the bark stripped away to reveal a symbol etched deep, a spiral, intersected by jagged lines like a web. It was new, too sharp and raw to have been weathered by time. My stomach turned as realization settled in. This place wasn't abandoned. Not truly. It was waiting. I don't remember leaving the clearing, only the frantic pace of my feet carrying me back through the trees, driven by instinct more than thought. By the time I reached my cabin again, the sun had set, and the forest was cloaked in darkness. My hands shook as I locked the door. Something I'd never done before, as though wood and iron could keep out whatever was moving out there. I knew, then, that the couple had stumbled too close to this place, that their disappearance had nothing to do with missteps or wild animals. They had seen something they weren't meant to, and the wilderness had been used as a cover to swallow them whole. But now I had seen it too, and I couldn't escape the creeping certainty that whoever had laid those traps, whoever had carved that symbol, already knew I had been there. After that night, nothing about my life felt like it had before. The ordinary tasks, paperwork, maintenance checks, answering phone calls from tourists asking whether the trail they'd planned was safe, had the texture of a dream, distant and unreal. In their place was the clearing, the iron teeth, the spiral carved into wood, and the terrible certainty that someone or something had been orchestrating this on purpose. I reached out to Walt more than once after I discovered the traps and the hidden camp, but his replies were short and hesitant, like a man trying to keep a storm from spilling out of his throat. He agreed to accompany me back into the hollows at first, then delayed, then came up with reasons to stay behind. An old injury acting up, a cousin needing help with a boat, a supply run he couldn't miss. I told myself he was cautious, that he knew when to step back and let the professionals handle it. But when 3 weeks passed and I hadn't seen him, the worry in my gut shifted to something colder. I went looking for him. The truth is, I think I always knew I would. Walt had been the one to give me the leather journal and the first graveled warning. These places sleep for a while. If he'd left, if he'd gone quiet because he'd seen something worse, then I needed to know why. I found his truck exactly where I'd seen it the day I first knocked on his door. Parked by the pier, its windows fogged, a thin film of salt crusting the bumper. The cabin was unlocked. The stove was dying embers, a kettle half full on the counter. Inside, his things were as they'd always been. Maps pinned on the wall, a coffee mug with a chipped rim, the same dog-eared paperback on the bedside table. But there were signs something had happened. A chair overturned, a trail of muddy footprints leading out the back door, and, most troubling of all, a note scrawled on a scrap of paper, words twisted and hurried. Do not go into the circle alone. No signature. No other explanation. That note should have warned me away. It did not. If anything, it steeled me. I took his truck and drove back along the gravel roads to the hollows, the wheel in my hands like an anchor. The sky was a low slab of gray, and the trees seemed to lean in to listen as I passed. I parked a half-mile from the clearing and walked the rest of the distance on foot, carrying a different kind of load this time. A backpack with more bullets than sense, a satellite phone I hoped I would never need, and Walt's leather-bound journal tucked inside my jacket like contraband. The closer I came, the worse my chest felt. The forest that day was a living thing. It breathed around me, exhaling faint smells that made me think of old blood and iron. When I found the clearing, the tripod stood like an accusation, and the fabric strips clung to it like corpses of birds. A new detail greeted me that I hadn't seen before. Small, neat piles of stones at each of the 4 cardinal points beyond the circle, each with its own set of precise, deliberate carvings. Whoever had been working here had been methodical, patient, and experienced. They weren't stumbling amateurs. They knew what they were doing. My fingers went to my mouth as I knelt to examine the ground. There were recent tracks this time, boot prints that led away from the circle toward the east, angled as though whoever had walked them wanted to avoid the main trail. I followed them, creeping between trunks with my rifle at the ready and my heartbeat loud enough to be a drum in my ears. The tracks wound through brush and over a fallen log, heading to a shallow ravine that I had passed without notice before. At the ravine's lip, someone had slept. A bedroll, flattened and still smelling faintly of smoke, lay half-concealed beneath a curtain of spruce boughs. There were signs of a recent fire. Charred twigs clustered neatly, a tin cup with coffee stains, a pack with straps gnawed by teeth, human or animal. I couldn't tell. I dug through the debris with gloved hands and found something that made my stomach drop. A small leather lanyard, the same kind that Walt used to wear, the one with the initials WG pressed into the leather. I should have rejoiced. I should have taken it as proof that Walt had been here and was perhaps nearby, but the lanyard felt like a clue left by someone who wanted me to find it.
It was staged.
And if it was staged, then this person wanted me in their sights. I climbed down into the ravine, following a shallow path where water, in drier seasons, might have cut away the earth. The ravine opened on a narrow clearing dominated by a haphazard structure of wooden beams and taut ropes. At first glance, it could have been a shelter, but its real purpose was more sinister. Hooks protruded from the beams, and lengths of chain hung like iron vines. On the ground beneath, more traps lay half buried in the muck. The air here was thick and heavy, and the hum returned, a low note that seemed to vibrate under my boots. Teeth chattered, though the day was not yet cold. I felt watched, not in the way a person watches, but in the way a tide presses against a shore, constant and inevitable. I called Walt's name once, my voice strangled by fear, and the forest swallowed it. Then I heard, faint and barely there, another sound that froze my blood, a small, thin laugh. It could have been anything, a bird, the creak of wood, but it carried a human cadence, and it made my skin crawl. I followed the sound, the trail narrow and treacherous, until I came upon a shallow pit dug into the soft earth. At the bottom, half hidden beneath a scrap of tarp, was a camera, one of those small trail cams used by hunters. Its lens was cracked, but the casing still held power. Beside it lay a torn piece of cloth with dried blood crusted along the seam and, worst of all, a scrap of paper with a few words typed on an antique typewriter. They remember. We feed them. No signatures. No explanations. Just a sentence that tasted like rot. I wanted to vomit. Instead, I sat back on my heels and tried to think like someone who could still be rational. Someone was maintaining a network of traps. Someone had a reason for all of this, a logic I couldn't see yet. The phrase, "we feed them," implied a community, a group with ritual or habit. The mountains had their hermits, their poachers, their people who lived off-grid and made choices the rest of us wouldn't, some for survival, some out of malice. But there was an intelligence behind these acts that felt older than all of that, as if the decisions were made according to a code not written in any human tongue. Night found me curled in a sleeping bag under a tarp I'd strung between trees, Walter's journal beside me like a talisman. I read through his entries by flashlight until the lines blurred. He had written about people he'd suspected, local men who liked the quiet, who had boats and access to old traps, who never quite fit in with the rest of the village. He had mentioned one name more than others, a man named Harlan Pike, an outsider who'd come through a decade earlier and never left. Harlan's history was checkered, accusations of poaching, of stealing traps, of threatening men who asked too many questions. Walt had kept a file on him, and he had written, in a line that felt like an omen, "Watch Harlan. If the hollows wake, he's at the center." I slept badly, dreams thick with the sound of iron snapping shut and the smell of old blood. When I woke, the sky was lighter, but the world felt no kinder. I packed my gear and set off for the small settlement where Harlan was supposed to live. The village sat on a narrow inlet, boats bobbing at the docks like sleeping beasts. Harlan's house was a squat wooden thing, paint flaking like dead skin. No lights. No smoke. The door was unlocked. Inside, the place was a museum of rust and wire. Stacks of traps, coils of chain, jars of preserved meat labeled with dates and odd notations. On a splintered table sat a notebook open to a page where the same spiral symbol had been drawn again and again, scribbled until it blurred into a void. I wanted to rage through that house, to tear it apart until the secrets spilled out, but something stopped me. A frame on the wall, a photograph of Harlan standing in a clearing with a line of men behind him, all of them grinning, arms slung over one another's shoulders. Walt's face was there, too, in the corner, younger, full of life. My throat closed. The journal had lied. The man Walt had warned me about had once been a friend. I slid the notebook back into its place and turned to a table where a map lay pinned flat. On it, dozens of tiny X's had been drawn along the ridgelines, each one marked in the same hand. Caches. In the margins, a name had been scrawled over and over, "Remember." As I left Harlan's house, the sun sank behind cloud and rain began, slow and insistent. My mind churned. The more I uncovered, the less comfortable I felt. The people involved were not simple monsters or solitary madmen. They were neighbors, friends, men who had lived here for years and had reasons for the things they did. Reasons wrapped in old superstitions, in fear of the wild, in a desire to contain whatever it was they believed lived in those circles. Walt hadn't been protecting me from a single bad apple. He'd been protecting me from a community that had learned to survive by bargaining with something the rest of us didn't understand. On the drive back through Bruised Light, I thought of Caleb and Marissa's faces on those missing posters, their laughter now preserved in photographs that felt obscene. Whoever they were, whatever the people who maintained the traps believed, had decided that feeding whatever it was included sacrificing the unwary. I kept thinking, against reason, that maybe the people doing this thought of themselves as keepers, not killers. That maybe they believed their acts were a necessary cruelty to keep a balance. It didn't make it any less monstrous. By the time I reached my cabin, rain had turned to sleet. I was soaked to the bone and furious, but behind that fury was a quieter, colder thing, a sense of betrayal. Walt had warned me, yes, but he also had contacts in this community, men he'd once trusted. Somewhere between loyalty and survival, he'd kept secrets. Whether he'd been complicit or simply afraid, I couldn't tell. The journal in his handwriting suggested both. I had to decide who to trust. I had to decide whether to bring the authorities in and let the law tear this fragile, terrible order apart, or whether to keep digging on my own, to risk being the next piece of evidence in a notebook someone would later find half buried in the mud. I slept poorly again, but this time the dreams were not of traps and bones so much as of Walt's face, older and lined, the stern lines around his mouth softening into something I couldn't read. In the morning I set my jaw and packed my things. There was one last place on Walt's map, a mark in the hollows he'd circled and labeled simply, "If all else fails." I didn't know what that meant. I only knew that I was running out of options. The forest wasn't going to unmake itself. The people who tended its hidden horrors weren't going to stop. If I wanted to stop them, I had to learn their rules or die trying. And so I walked back into the trees with the stubbornness of someone who had already lost too much to quit. The last mark on Walt's map sat like a brand on the paper, circled 3 times in heavy ink, the words, "If all else fails," scrawled beside it. I studied it for hours before I set out, staring until the lines blurred into rivers and ridges in my vision. It was farther than the other sites I'd found, tucked into a section of the hollows where no trails existed, no cabins stood, and even the most stubborn hunters rarely ventured. I prepared as best I could. Extra ammunition, food packed tight, a heavy coil of rope, and the sat phone stowed in my jacket, though I doubted it would find a signal. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. By then I didn't trust the local sheriff, and I sure as hell didn't trust the men who had been Walt's neighbors, the ones who might have carved spirals into beams while laughing over a beer with him a week later. This was mine to face, and maybe it always had been. The trek took me 2 full days. The weather turned fast, as it always did here, sky closing in with sheets of sleet and winds that clawed at my clothes. I moved like a ghost between the trees, guided only by the compass and the coordinates Walt had left. The land seemed to resist me, as though the forest itself tried to steer me away. Branches snapped in the distance with no animal in sight. The undergrowth seemed to thicken at random, and more than once I found myself circling the same moss-covered stump I swore I'd passed an hour earlier. But the journal helped. Walt had written of tricks to counter the hollow's illusions, stacking stones at every 100 paces, scoring trees with a blade to mark direction, never letting one's mind wander for more than a moment. Following those rituals, I pressed deeper until the air grew heavier, the silence thicker, as if the forest were holding its breath. I found the place near dusk on the second day. It was no clearing this time, but a depression in the earth, a natural bowl ringed by twisted spruce whose trunks bent unnaturally, all leaning inward as though dragged by some unseen weight. In the center stood a stone structure, rough-hewn, no taller than my waist, its surface etched with the same spiral patterns I'd seen carved into wood. Around it, the ground was littered with bones, animal mostly, deer and elk, but mixed among them were smaller, human-like remains. My throat tightened as I crouched to lift a fragment of jawbone, the teeth still intact. Someone had been using this place for decades, maybe longer. This was the heart of it, the reason for the traps and the sacrifices. As I approached the stone altar, the hum began again. Louder now, vibrating through my chest, resonating with my heartbeat until it felt like my veins carried the sound. My flashlight beam skittered across the stones, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. Objects embedded in the spiral carvings, coins, buttons, bits of jewelry, all offerings pressed into the grooves as though by countless hands over the years. And among them, lodged at the very center, was a thin silver chain with a small heart-shaped pendant. I didn't need to open it to know whose it had been. Marissa's. The couple had made it this far. They'd seen what lay at the core, and for that, they had been silenced. I wanted to smash the altar, to scatter the bones and burn the clearing, but before I could move, a sound cut through the hum. Footsteps. More than one pair, crunching snow in steady rhythm. My stomach dropped. I killed my light and crouched low behind a fallen log, rifle in hand, breath shallow. Shapes emerged between the trees, 4 men, bundled in heavy coats, their faces hidden in shadow. They moved with purpose, carrying bundles I recognized all too well, chains, iron traps, lengths of rope. My gut clenched as I realized I was watching the caretakers of this place, the ones who fed whatever hunger lived here. They worked in silence, placing traps around the perimeter, dragging animal carcasses toward the altar, arranging stones as though rehearsing a ritual older than language. One of them stepped closer, his hood falling back, and I saw his face in the pale light. Harlan Pike, the man Walt had named in his journal, the man who was supposed to be the heart of this nightmare. His expression was calm, almost reverent, as he set a lantern on the altar and lit it. The flame flickered, and the hum deepened, vibrating until the trees themselves seemed to groan. Harlan raised his head, eyes half closed, lips moving in words I couldn't hear. The others joined him, their voices low and steady, chanting in unison. My skin prickled with terror. This wasn't just superstition. This was ritual, practiced and precise, passed down like scripture. I should have fled then. Every instinct screamed at me to back away, to vanish into the forest before they noticed. But I couldn't. The sight of Marissa's pendant glinting in the stone froze me in place, rage rising like a tide. I shifted, just enough for my boot to brush against a branch. It snapped with a sharp crack that cut through their chanting like a gunshot. The voices stopped. The men turned as one, lantern light catching their eyes. Harlan's gaze locked onto mine across the clearing, and in that instant I felt something deeper than fear, a certainty that he knew me, had been expecting me. I bolted, crashing through undergrowth, heart pounding, the hum swelling until it drowned out my thoughts. Shouts rang out behind me, boots pounding in pursuit. I didn't dare fire my rifle. The sound would pin me like prey. I ran blind, trusting only the notches I'd carved into trees earlier, stumbling and rising again as branches tore at my face. They were faster, younger, relentless. My lungs burned, and still the forest offered no cover, no mercy. Then, ahead, I saw the faint gleam of water, the ravine I'd crossed earlier. I scrambled down the bank, half sliding, half falling, and wedged myself beneath a fallen tree at the water's edge, mud seeping into my clothes. The men reached the ravine minutes later. Their lanterns bobbed like will-o'-the-wisps, beams cutting across the dark. I held my breath as they passed above me, voices low. Harlan's words carried through the night, calm and certain. He's seen it. He belongs to them now. My chest constricted, bile rising in my throat. They moved on, their lights fading, their footsteps merging with the hum until both were gone. Only when silence returned did I crawl from my hiding place, shaking uncontrollably. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't move until dawn lit the sky. And when it did, I knew I couldn't stay. The hollows would not let me go twice. I staggered back toward the ridge, following my notches, stumbling until my legs gave way beneath me. Somehow, I made it to the road, where a passing truck picked me up and drove me back to town. The driver asked what I was doing out there, what had happened to my face, but I couldn't speak. The words would not form. Back in my cabin, I tried to write it all down, every detail, every step, every word I'd overheard. I thought if I left a record, maybe someone, someday, would believe me. But as the days turned to weeks, I realized the truth. No one wanted to believe. The sheriff dismissed my story as fatigue, too much time in the woods. The few locals I trusted turned their eyes away when I mentioned Harlan. And Walt never returned. His cabin stood empty, his boat still moored, his maps yellowing on the walls. Whether he had fled or been taken, I never found out. That was months ago. Now I sit here, staring at the fire in my stove, the journal heavy in my lap. Sometimes, at night, I still hear it, the hum rising from the earth, faint but insistent, vibrating in my bones. Sometimes I see lanterns flickering in the trees beyond my cabin, though when I go outside, nothing waits but silence. And sometimes, when the wind cuts through the valley, I hear voices carried on it, low, steady, chanting words I can't quite make out. I don't know how long I can keep this secret. Maybe writing it down will be enough. Maybe it won't. But I know one thing with certainty, Caleb and Marissa didn't vanish because of missteps or chance. They were chosen, offered up to something this wilderness hides too well. And I've looked into the heart of it. I've seen the altar, heard the chant, watched the men who keep the balance. And I know they haven't forgotten me. The forest is patient. It waits. And someday, when I least expect it, I fear the hollows will come to collect what it believes is owed.